I'm here with Lord Adair Turner. Now, Adair, the last time we saw each other was the back end of 2022 at the Climate Change Conference in Egypt.
In Egypt,
and a lot has changed since then. I mean, how are you feeling about things?
Well, when I think about what's occurred since then, I think of three things. One, it's become ever more apparent that the climate is changing and at a pace which is really worrying, which ought therefore to make us more determined to deal with this climate change problem and achieve an energy transition. So that wakes me up. The second thing that worries me is that there's been a major political development in the US, whereas when we met in Sharm el-Sheikh, the US was very, very strongly supporting the progress towards dealing with global emissions. It was negotiating with China. It was putting its shoulder to the wheel of global emissions reductions and negotiations. But it now has a completely different point of view. It has pulled out of the Paris process. That's very concerning. But if those two were in danger of meaning that I don't want to get out of bed in the morning, the thing that makes me excited is that the technologies and the deployment of technologies has continued at an even faster pace than I imagined. So in particular, key technologies like the cost of solar PV and the cost of batteries, these have come down dramatically since we met in Egypt. Battery technology is progressing rapidly, and places like the UK are continuing to make progress on decarbonisation. Let me give you one example. A lot of people don't know this. Back in 2010, the UK's electricity, to generate it, it produced 500 grams per kilowatt hour of electricity produced. That figure is now 125. In the last 14 years, we've driven down the carbon intensity of our electricity 75%. We've got to do much more, but we should be better at telling the story about what these extraordinary technologies are enabling us to do. So it's the technologies and the technology development and many of the businesses in this room and elsewhere who are continue to invest that make me still reasonably optimistic, or at least determined, despite the bad trends in the climate and despite the worrying trends in the politics.
I mean, I think that's what's so fascinating, isn't it? Is despite this sort of political rhetoric that we're starting to see, if people didn't know any better, they would maybe think that, I mean, this transition wasn't happening, or it was all, it was all kind of down in the dumps, it's all too difficult. You come to conferences like these, and also like you and I do, working on the ground with entrepreneurs, innovators, these businesses that are making this stuff happen. And really, that disconnect is huge. That gap is huge.
It is a disconnect, and I think what's interesting is some of the trends are now unstoppable. Let's take electric vehicles, right? Within 2 or 3 years, you are going to see electric vehicles from lots of manufacturers, the Chinese, but also all the big Europeans, which will do 500, 600 kilometer range, and which will cost less than the equivalent sized internal combustion engine. We are on the verge of a complete revolution there, even if we didn't worry about climate change. And the vast majority of people who buy electric vehicles simply cannot imagine going back to that sort of odd, noisy, rather smelly thing called the internal combustion engine. This is a revolution that will happen. Now, there are other bits of what has to happen where it needs policy support. But we're also seeing some very surprising initiatives in policy support. In the middle of March, the International Maritime Organization voted by a very strong majority to introduce a carbon levy on shipping in order to drive a dramatic reduction over time in the emissions from global shipping. And China voted for that, and India voted for that, and Brazil voted for it, as well as all the Europeans. Indeed, the biggest vote not for it was not the people who were against, but there were about 25 countries that abstained because they wanted a still stronger commitment, and they were worried, this was particularly the Pacific Island countries, that this wasn't strong enough. But it's a very major step forward, and it's occurring that the US actually boycotted the discussions, but it didn't stop the rest of the world saying, no, we are moving on to the decarbonisation of shipping. Also, I would say, in the European Union has recently issued in March a new plan on steel and metal industry action, which I think is going to hugely support the decarbonisation of European steel industry while maintaining its competitiveness. So a lot's going on in technology, a lot is going on in the policy environment as well. And I think you will see at Belém in Brazil in November a continued determination of most of the countries in the world to say, look, this problem we have to deal with, and we're going to keep dealing with it, even if America, at least for now, is not part of the game.
And so you hit on a really important point there about heavy industry and about retaining the type of capability within Europe that allows us to manufacture, critical materials such as steel, ceramics, etc. What would you say to those that would argue that actually decarbonisation is driving the offshoring of the manufacture of those materials, and that we're leaving ourselves in a more vulnerable, weaker position?
Well, look, it's very important that we have a level playing field in relation to the carbon intensity of production. And that's why one of the things that the European Union did in its Steel and Metal Action Plan was to reinforce what's called the CBAM, the border carbon adjustment, to make sure that imports of goods face the same carbon price as domestic producers. And I think you will find that a way of really supporting steel manufacture in Europe going forward, and also chemicals. Now, you have to accept that there may be some parts of industrial process that, even when you have a level playing field, may be logically located somewhere else. So if I look at iron production rather than steel production, which is the first stage, it may be that in the long run, the cheapest place to do that in a green fashion is Morocco or Mauritania or Australia or Chile, not Europe, because we may want to use green hydrogen, and those are places where it's much cheaper to produce green hydrogen than it is in Europe. So we can't say we've got to keep every bit of the industry we do at the moment, but I think a huge amount of industry will continue to be dynamic and successful in Europe as long as we have this level playing field. And what we need to say to the rest of the world is, we do have a border carbon tariff. We don't want any revenue out of it, because what we want you to do is impose a carbon price in India, in Turkey, in China. And by the way, that debate is beginning to develop. When I go to China, which I do a couple of times a year, increasingly I'm dealing with Chinese policymakers who accept that China will have to head towards having the same sort of carbon price that we have in Europe.